Birth of a Sith. The child was born beneath a pale sun that cast the desert world in tones of bone and rust, the kind of light that bleached color from everything it touched, as if the planet itself had long since resigned to emptiness. The year was in the age of the Old Republic, when the Galactic Senate's banner stretched across thousands of systems and the Jedi Army of Light enforced its will as peacekeepers and soldiers. To most citizens in the core, the Republic was civilization itself, the shining heir to millennia of expansion and governance. But out here on the rim, on a planet whose name rarely made it onto the trade charts, that same Republic was little more than a distant overseer with an insatiable hunger for taxes and resources. The settlement where the child drew his first breath was a sprawl of weather-worn shelters dug into the sandstone cliffs, each home built to endure sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. The people survived through barter and grit, their daily lives an unending game of advantage and deception, cheating off-world traders, skimming rations from local administrators, scavenging anything of value from the wastes. The child's mother, a woman with calloused hands and a gaze that flinched from nothing, had already buried 2 children before this one. The father, a mechanic who could coax a failing power cell back to life with nothing but scrap wire and a curse, was more practical. Survival was all that mattered here. Yet when the midwife held the newborn up and the first cries rose over the howling wind outside, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The alien medic present, an Ithorian contracted by the Republic to provide basic healthcare to the outer settlements, paused with instruments still in hand. The mother's eyes narrowed, the father's jaw set. No one spoke it aloud, but there was something in the way the newborn looked back at the world. The gaze was not unfocused or confused as it should have been, but direct, as though the infant were already measuring the people around him, weighing them. The Ithorian shuffled his feet and muttered something about a strange reading on the bioscanner before leaving too quickly, and the parents exchanged a glance that was not joy but unease. As the boy grew, the unease deepened. By his 3rd year, the household animals, half-wild scavenger birds and stocky desert grazers, bolted whenever he came near. By 5, the other children avoided him, claiming he could make them do things they didn't want to do just by staring. By 8, his mother avoided physical contact, moving around him as though he carried an unseen contagion. His father spoke less and less, the silences between them filled with the background hiss of the desert wind. At 12, the incidents could no longer be passed off as odd coincidence. Objects moved when he was angry, rolling cups, sliding tools, once even slamming the heavy front door hard enough to crack its frame. People whispered. The settlement was small enough that whispers traveled quickly, and soon the name Cursed followed him through the narrow alleys. His parents said little, but the shame in their eyes was louder than words. It might have gone on like that, resentment building until it collapsed into violence, if not for the arrival of Lord Rivek. The first anyone saw of him was a shadow on the horizon, a black silhouette against the heat-shimmering dunes, growing steadily larger until the twin peaks of his shuttle's wings cut the sun in half. The craft settled in a storm of dust just outside the settlement walls, and from it descended a tall figure in dark lacquered armor, chased with crimson inlays. His face was hidden behind a mask worked with jagged markings, his presence so heavy it seemed to draw the air inward. The guards at the settlement gate stepped aside without a word as he passed. He came to the family's door and knocked only once before stepping inside, moving like someone who had never in his life been refused entry anywhere. The boy's father rose halfway from his seat, but the stranger's gaze froze him in place. "Your son has a gift," Lord Rivek said without preamble, his voice a deep metallic echo behind the mask. "One that your world cannot nurture and your people will not understand. The force moves in him strongly." The word force meant little to the boy, but the tone was like the first low roll of thunder before a storm. The Sith Lord paced slowly through the small room, gloved fingers trailing over the rough wooden table. "He belongs at the academy on Korriban," Rivek continued, "among those who will teach him to use his strength, not fear it." He reached into a pouch and tossed a fistful of credit chits onto the table, more wealth than the family had seen in their lives. "You will never have to work again. The boy's mother glanced at the credits only once before her gaze shifted to her son. There was no warmth in it, only relief. "Take him," she said, and the boy felt something inside him twist. Not grief exactly, but a hollow recognition that whatever bond had existed between them had been a fragile, temporary thing. The father said nothing. He did not meet his son's eyes. Rivek placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and together they stepped out into the pale light. The shuttle lifted away from the desert world, carrying the boy into the black sea of stars, toward a future that would strip away the last traces of who he had been. The journey through hyperspace was short but disorienting, a tunnel of impossible light that seemed to bend the body and mind in ways he could not describe. When they emerged, the viewport was filled with the rust-red expanse of Korriban. It was not a welcoming world. Jagged mountains and shadowed valleys stretched under a thin, dust-choked atmosphere, and here and there rose colossal stone tombs carved into the cliffs, their weathered faces marked with the likenesses of long-dead warriors and kings. The shuttle descended toward a citadel complex built directly into the mouth of a canyon. Even before landing, the boy could feel the weight of the place pressing against him. Not physical pressure, but a dense awareness, as though unseen eyes were watching from every shadow. The air smelled of iron and dust, and something older, something that hummed just beyond the edge of hearing. Rivek led him down a causeway lined with statues, each one a towering armored figure with a lightsaber clutched in its stone fists. The boy's steps echoed too loudly on the black stone. At the great doors of the academy, they were met by a figure in plain dark robes, his head shaved, eyes cold and assessing. This was the overseer, Rivek explained, one of many who would decide whether the boy would rise in power or die in training. There would be no formal welcome, no gentle introduction. The Sith did not believe in easing their acolytes into the darkness. The overseer wasted no time. "Awakening," he said, and two guards in segmented armor took the boy by the arms and marched him through the halls and down a narrow stair into the bowels of the academy. There they unlatched the door and shoved him into blackness. The smell hit him first, a mix of damp stone and the rank musk of something alive. Then the sound, claws scrabbling on the floor, wings rustling. His eyes adjusted enough to see shapes moving in the shadows, low and fast. Chirac beasts, he would later learn, predators native to the valleys of Korriban, each the size of a man, with membranous wings and jaws lined with needle teeth. The first lunged from the dark, a blur of leathery hide and bone-white fangs. The boy's body moved before his mind caught up, ducking, twisting, his hand snapping out to grab a jagged stone from the floor and smashing it into the creature's skull. It dropped, twitching. The second came from the side, claws raking his arm, but before pain could register, something surged up inside him. Heat, pressure, a coiled force unwinding, and the beast slammed into the wall with a sickening crack, its spine folding in a way no living thing could survive. The third circled warily, its eyes reflecting red in the gloom. This time the boy did not wait. He reached for that same inner surge and wrapped it around the creature's throat. It thrashed, shrieked, and then went limp. Silence settled heavy in the tomb. When the door creaked open, the overseer stood framed in the light, expression unreadable. He gave the barest nod. "Fear becomes anger," he said. "Anger becomes power. Remember this." The boy stepped into the corridor, blood streaking his face, his arm trembling from exertion, but a new certainty forming in his mind. Whatever this place was, whatever it demanded, he would survive it, not because survival was the goal, but because it was the only path to anything greater, the Sith Academy. The corridors of the Sith Academy swallowed the boy like the throat of some great beast, each step drawing him deeper into a world where the light of the outside galaxy did not reach. The walls were hewn from black stone, shot through with veins of crimson crystal that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, their glow barely enough to illuminate the intricate carvings of warriors, beasts, and ancient battles that lined every surface. The air was heavy, metallic, tinged with the faint scent of incense and scorched ozone, and somewhere far below came the distant rhythmic pounding of drums, a sound that set the pace of life within these walls. The boy was given no time to rest after the awakening. The Sith did not coddle their acolytes, nor did they believe in gradual acclimatization. The moment he returned from the tomb, still bloodied and shaking, he was led to the Great Training Hall, a vast chamber ringed with tiered balconies where instructors in dark armor watched from above like vultures awaiting a kill. On the polished obsidian floor, dozens of initiates moved through drills with training sabers, the clashing of blades ringing out in perfect unison. The overseer barked his name to a group at the far end, and without hesitation, he stepped into their formation, taking the place of one who had just been cut down and dragged aside. There were no pleasantries, no instructions, only the immediate expectation that he matched the pace and precision of those around him. The training was brutal from the first moment. Instructors moved among the acolytes like predators, striking without warning to test their awareness. A missed parry meant a crack across the knuckles, a hesitation meant a blow to the ribs. Pain was not punishment here. It was the lesson. "Feel it," one instructor snarled when his strike left a welt across the boy's shoulder. "Let it sharpen you." Days and nights bled together into a relentless cycle. Mornings began with physical conditioning on the open terraces, where the thin, dry air of Korriban made every breath a labor. They ran the canyon trails until their legs gave out, climbed sheer cliff faces with nothing but their fingers and willpower to hold them, and sparred on narrow ledges where a single misstep would send them tumbling into the rocks below. Midday brought weapons drills, first with training sabers, then with weighted durasteel rods to build strength and precision, and finally with live blades when the instructors deemed them ready, though ready often meant nothing more than unlikely to kill themselves immediately. Afternoons were devoted to the Force. Here the boy learned to reach inward, to find the current of heat and pressure that had saved him in the tomb, and to draw it forth at will. The Sith encouraged emotion, not detachment. Anger was not a thing to be banished, but a furnace to be stoked. The instructors would taunt, provoke, and even injure the acolytes to spark that flame, urging them to push harder, hit faster, strike with intent to kill. The Jedi fear passion because it makes them strong, an overseer lectured, pacing before them. We embrace it because it makes us unstoppable. Nights were no reprieve. Starvation drills taught them to conserve strength. Days without food broken by sudden combat trials that forced them to fight on the edge of collapse. Sleep deprivation exercises left their minds raw and stripped of hesitation, their instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. And always there were the cullings. At first, these were matches to unconsciousness, staged in the training halls while overseers watched from above. But as the months passed, the rules shifted. First to bouts where serious injury was not only allowed but encouraged, then to duels where the only outcome was death. The boy learned quickly that in the academy, survival was not only about skill, but about reading the currents of ambition and rivalry that swirled around him. Alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying speed. A comrade in morning drills could be an assassin in the sleeping quarters by night. He found himself drawn into this game, forging temporary partnerships with those who could be useful, betraying them when their utility waned, defending himself from the same in turn. It was a constant test of wit as much as strength, a lesson in the first unspoken rule of the Sith: trust no one fully, but know everyone well enough to predict their next move. Over time, his abilities grew in both subtlety and ferocity. In the Force training chambers, he learned to extend his awareness beyond sight and sound, sensing the intentions of those around him before they acted. He could push, pull, and crush with invisible hands, send opponents sprawling, or snap their necks with the twist of thought. He learned to channel pain into power, each injury feeding the dark current within him. In the weapons halls, he mastered the Shicho form for broad, sweeping strikes against multiple foes, then moved to the more precise Makashi, where every movement was economy and every thrust was a potential killing blow. Outside formal training, he explored the hidden corners of the academy. In the archives, lit only by the pale glow of holocrons, he listened to the whispering voices of long-dead Sith Lords, their spectral images offering fragments of forbidden knowledge. In the catacombs, he found meditation chambers carved into the stone, their walls inscribed with the code of the Sith. each word etched deep as if by the claws of some ancient beast, and in the dueling pits he watched older acolytes fight for the right to challenge Sith Lords themselves, knowing that victory meant apprenticeship and survival, while defeat meant death and obscurity. It was during one such match that he first saw the price of weakness in the Sith's eyes. A fellow initiate, older and stronger, fought well but hesitated at the killing blow, glancing up at the overseers as if seeking approval. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. His opponent's blade took him across the throat, and his body was dragged away without ceremony. "Mercy is for the dead," the overseer said, his voice carrying across the pit. "You are not dead. Remember that." Years passed like this, the seasons marked only by the shifting winds of the canyon and the changing roster of faces in the training halls. By his 16th year, of the 20 acolytes who had arrived with him, only 7 remained. The rest had been cut down in training, executed for failure, or vanished into the shadows of the catacombs, their fates unspoken. The boy, now a young man hardened by endless trials, had not only survived but thrived. His body bore the scars of hundreds of fights, each one a reminder of an opponent who had fallen before him. His mind was sharper, quicker, his connection to the Force deeper and more instinctive. The overseers began to speak of him in tones of cautious respect, and whispers circulated among the acolytes that he might one day challenge for a place among the Sith Lords themselves. But here too was a lesson. In the academy, greatness was as dangerous as weakness. To stand out was to draw attention, and attention was the surest path to becoming someone else's target. He learned to temper his displays, to win with just enough flair to be noticed, but not so much as to inspire immediate assassination attempts. Even so, he knew that his time as an acolyte was drawing to a close. The galaxy beyond Korriban was in flames. The Brotherhood of Darkness and the Jedi Army of Light clashed across 100 worlds, and the call for new warriors was constant. Soon, he would leave the shadowed halls for the open battlefields of the war, and when that day came, he intended to step into the galaxy not as another nameless blade in the Brotherhood's ranks, but as someone the Jedi would remember in fear. War and the making of a Sith Lord. When the summons finally came, it arrived, not with ceremony, but with the sharp clang of a fist on his door and a curt order from an overseer. "Arm yourself. You're leaving." By that evening, he stood on the landing platform beneath Korriban's blood-red sky, watching a line of transports lift away toward the warfront. His own craft, a dagger-shaped corvette of Sith design, its black hull etched with runic markings, awaited with its engines already keening. Inside, the air hummed with the presence of veterans, Sith warriors clad in segmented armor, their crimson blades hanging at their belts, infiltrators in stealth gear, silent as shadows, and the hulking figure of a pure-blood Sith commander who eyed the young man with the slow assessment of a predator, deciding whether this new arrival was prey or competition. The war had burned across the galaxy for decades, but now the Brotherhood of Darkness was on the offensive, driving into Republic territory with ruthless momentum. His first assignment was not to lead troops in open battle, but to learn the art of war in its most insidious form, sabotage and infiltration under the guidance of a veteran known only as the Infiltrator, a masked operative whose voice was as cold as the space between stars. Their ship made for the mid-rim, where Republic supply lines crisscrossed vulnerable sectors, feeding garrisons on embattled worlds. They struck like phantoms. On the gas mining stations of Talvos, they slipped past security, planting detonators on the primary fuel conduits. The resulting fireball gutted the facility and left the sector dark for weeks. On an ice moon in the Trail system, they posed as traders to infiltrate a Republic comms relay, slicing into its systems to feed false orders to entire fleets, sending reinforcements to empty coordinates while Sith armadas struck undefended worlds. Each mission taught him that war was not only fought with armies, but with fear, confusion, and the careful removal of keystones in the enemy's infrastructure. Yet it was on the dusty plains of Ballora that he first faced the Jedi. The objective was straightforward: cripple a Republic outpost serving as a staging ground for their advance into Sith-held space. The assault began under cover of night, the Sith forces sweeping in with the speed and precision of a sandstorm. Blaster fire lit the darkness in staccato bursts, and the young Sith cut through defenders like a blade through cloth, his lightsaber a red arc in the chaos. Then, amid the smoke and shouts, she appeared, a Mirialan Jedi Knight, her green skin glistening with the heat of battle, her movements calm and deliberate. She wielded a blue lightsaber with a fluid grace that seemed to draw the chaos around her into a kind of order. He engaged her without hesitation, driving forward with the aggressive, punishing strikes that had served him well in the academy, but she did not meet force with force. She deflected, redirected, letting his own momentum carry him just out of position before sliding her blade in with surgical precision. It was like fighting water, impossible to pin down, endlessly adaptive. Frustration flared into anger, and anger into power. He pressed harder, his strikes faster, heavier, the air between them crackling with the heat of their clashing blades. Then, in a break between exchanges, he caught her eyes. There was no hatred there, no fear, only a deep, steady compassion that infuriated him more than any insult could have. How could she look at him in the midst of battle and not despise him? The duel dragged on, each finding and exploiting weaknesses in the other's style, until at last a feint opened her guard and he drove his blade between her ribs. She exhaled softly, a sound not of pain but of release, and as the light faded from her eyes, he felt her presence dissolve into the Force, not in terror, but in acceptance. The sensation rattled him more than the fight itself. When the battle was over and the outpost reduced to slag, he found himself replaying that final moment, unsettled by the alien strength he had seen in her serenity. In the weeks that followed, his record on the battlefield grew rapidly. He led raids on Republic depots, intercepted convoys, and spearheaded lightning strikes that crippled defenses before the enemy could respond. His command style blended the ferocity of a frontline warrior with the precision of a saboteur. He struck where the enemy least expected, vanished before reinforcements could arrive, and left destruction in his wake. Word of his successes spread through the Brotherhood until, after a particularly decisive campaign on Ruusan, where his unit obliterated a hidden Jedi enclave, he was summoned to the command tent of Lord Scare Khan himself. The tent was vast, its walls heavy, with the stench of oil and sweat lit by the flicker of braziers that cast shadows like grasping hands. Khan stood at the far end, flanked by 2 guards in black plate, his eyes cold and calculating as he studied the young warrior. "You have done well," Khan said, his voice like a blade dragged over stone. "Well enough to earn a place at the table." With those words, the boy who had left the desert behind was gone forever. In his place stood a Sith Lord, recognized by the Brotherhood, no longer an acolyte, but an equal in title to those who had once been his overseers. Yet the title was no shield. Within the Brotherhood of Darkness, equality was a veneer over the reality of constant competition and barely checked ambition. The Darth title was forbidden under Khan's rule, ostensibly to prevent infighting, but in truth to mask his own fear of rivals rising too quickly. So all were lords, though each was both mentor and mortal enemy to those beneath them. His apprenticeship under senior Sith Lords was a crucible unlike any training on Korriban. In the field, they taught him the forbidden arts the Jedi reviled, how to drain the life essence from a foe until their body withered, how to weave illusions so vivid they could kill a mind trapped within them, how to bleed a kyber crystal until it screamed, turning its light to the deep, angry red of the Sith. These lessons were as dangerous to the practitioner as to the target, each one a flirtation with madness, each victory marked by some small erosion of body or soul. Through it all, the war raged. On Ruusan, his forces clashed with the Jedi Army of Light in a struggle for control of the planet's fungus forests and its force-rich nexus points. The air was thick with spores that clung to armor and skin, the ground soft underfoot, the constant hum of the Force like a second heartbeat in his skull. Here, amidst the strange beauty of the alien landscape, he learned that battles were fought as much in the mind as with the blade. The Jedi adapted quickly, using the terrain against the Sith, forcing skirmishes into narrow choke points where their defensive styles could hold against the Sith's aggression. But he adapted in turn, using feints and misdirection to draw them into ambushes, turning their caution into a weapon. It was in these battles that his reputation began to solidify. Not just as a warrior, but as a tactician who could twist the enemy's strengths into vulnerabilities. Among the Brotherhood's rank and file, his name was spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness. Among its leadership, it drew a different reaction, attention, and in the Brotherhood, attention was always dangerous. Politics, betrayal, and survival. The title of Sith Lord was an honor in name alone, a fragile crown balanced on a blade's edge, for in the Brotherhood of Darkness, power was not a station one reached and held. It was a rung on a ladder that others were already climbing beneath you, knives in hand. Every council chamber was a battlefield without swords, every corridor a gauntlet of measured glances, whispered alliances, and unseen threats. Outwardly, Lord Khan's doctrine of equality among Sith was meant to unify the ranks and prevent the kind of civil wars that had torn the Order apart in past centuries. In practice, it merely drove ambition into the shadows, forcing rivalries into the language of subtle sabotage and assassination. No one could be trusted, and so everyone learned to trust in nothing but themselves. Days in the field were almost restful compared to the suffocating intrigue of the war camps. On the front lines, the enemy wore the colors of the Republic, their blades gleaming blue and green in the haze of battle. In camp, the enemy might be the man you'd fought beside that morning, his hand steady on the hilt as he helped you to your feet, his mind already considering how best to remove you from the board before nightfall. He adapted quickly to this truth, his years in the Academy's cutthroat halls having been nothing more than the apprenticeship for the game now being played at the highest level. He cultivated the appearance of confidence without arrogance, strength without threat, enough to be respected, not so much as to draw immediate fire. He accepted invitations to private councils but always left early, citing urgent matters at the front, and he offered advice in strategy sessions that favored other lords' proposals just slightly more than his own. He learned to speak without revealing, to agree without committing, to smile without warmth, but even the most careful step eventually lands on a trap. It began with small anomalies, intelligence reports arriving too late to be of use, supply shipments that vanished en route to his outposts, whispers in the mess tents that questioned his loyalty to Khan's strategies. He doubled his security and kept his own counsel, but the pressure built. Then, one night on Rusan, beneath the rotting canopy of the fungus forest, where the war camp's air was thick with the damp, earthy smell of decay, the trap was sprung. The first sign was not the assassins themselves, but the sudden stillness in the air, the faint hitch in the rhythm of the wind through the towering stalks. He was half out of his bedroll when the tent flap whispered aside and shadows slipped in. 3 of them, moving with the coordinated silence of professionals, their silhouettes lean and coiled like drawn wire. The first assassin came at him low, blade angled for the gut, while the second struck high, a feint meant to drive his defense upward. The third hung back, hands weaving in a pattern that made the air hum, a forced technique, he realized, to dull his reactions. But years of training and the raw instinct of survival moved him faster than thought. He rolled to the side, feeling the heat of the first blade pass close enough to scorch the edge of his tunic, came up with his own lightsaber already alive in his hands, its crimson glow flooding the tent. The space erupted into chaos. Steel and energy clashed in sparks and bursts of light, the hiss of plasma slicing through the damp air. One assassin darted behind him, aiming to sever his spine. He spun, their blades locking in a shower of red and silver before he forced the attacker back with a burst of telekinetic force that sent them crashing into a tent pole hard enough to splinter wood. The second pressed in, strikes raining down in a blur, each one a precise attempt at a vital point, but he met them with an equal ferocity, their sabers shrieking against each other in the cramped quarters. The third broke off the weave of force suppression and switched to offense, lunging in with a wickedly curved dagger that glistened with the oily sheen of poison. Pain flared as the blade grazed his ribs, cold fire spreading from the wound, and he realized too late what it was. Sith poison, brewed to unravel the connection between mind and muscle, leaving the victim helpless long before death came. The world tilted under him, his grip faltering for the first time. Desperation clawed at him, but it was met with something hotter, sharper, Rage. He seized the nearest assassin with the Force and slammed them into the ground hard enough to hear the snap of bone, then pivoted and drove his saber clean through the second before they could recover. The third came on fast, seeing weakness, but he met them head on, his blade cutting a red arc that left their headless body collapsing into the dirt. The tent smelled of burnt cloth and blood. His breath came ragged, vision narrowing as the poison spread, but he forced himself to stand, to look upon the dead and commit every detail to memory. These had not been Republic agents. Their armor bore the subtle insignia of the Brotherhood's elite, a personal guard only deployed at the command of high-ranking lords. A search of their pouches confirmed what his instincts already screamed. A data chip bearing orders from Lord Kopek, one of Khan's inner circle, citing his growing prominence as a destabilizing threat. Kopek feared him, and in the Brotherhood, fear was currency. That night, as the camp's medics worked to purge the poison from his blood, he swore that every name behind this attempt would be erased one by one. Retaliation in the Sith tradition was not a matter of simple revenge. It was a performance, a statement to be read by the entire political body. Kopek was first, found days later in his command tent with his throat opened, the guards outside swearing they had heard nothing but the night wind. The official report blamed his own apprentice, who had been seen fleeing the scene in a panic, but those who understood the true language of Sith politics recognized the signature in the method, swift, clean, and leaving no trace but the intended message. Others followed. A rival commander's troops received falsified battle orders, sending them straight into a Jedi ambush. None returned. An ambitious upstart who had spoken too loudly of new leadership was lured into a private meeting and left hanging from the rafters of his own transport bay. Even those who had not moved openly against him began to tread more carefully, weighing whether their ambitions were worth the inevitable price. His influence grew in the shadows, apprentices and lesser lords seeking his patronage, drawn by his reputation for rewarding loyalty as fiercely as he punished betrayal. Yet the victories carried a cost that could not be measured in power alone. The dark side, ever generous to those who fed it, took its toll in other ways. His skin, once bronzed by the desert sun of his birthworld, paled to the ashen hue common among those who steeped themselves in Sith sorcery. The whites of his eyes yellowed, the irises deepening to a predator's gold. His veins stood out dark beneath the skin, and the muscles that had once moved with unthinking precision ached with a stiffness no healer could ease. Worse still, those who remained close to him for long began to suffer in ways no physician could explain. His most trusted apprentice, a fierce and cunning warrior in her own right, aged a decade in the span of months, her skin sagging, her hair going brittle and white. A captain who had served loyally for years developed a wasting sickness, his once powerful frame withering until he could no longer stand. He began to suspect the truth, that the power he drew from the dark side was not conjured from nothing, but siphoned from those around him, the energy sustaining him leeching life from others like heat drawn from a dying fire. It was then that his interest in the ancient texts of the Sith deepened into obsession. Between campaigns, he haunted the archives and abandoned temples of Rusan, seeking scrolls and holocrons that spoke of alchemy and essence transfer. There were whispers of immortality in these pages, of lords who had bound their spirits to amulets, statues, even the bodies of others. Most of the accounts ended in madness, the subject consumed by the process they sought to master, but the promise was enough to drive him deeper into study. He began to conduct his own experiments in secret, using captured Republic soldiers and even failed Sith apprentices as test subjects, twisting their forms, probing the boundary between life and the formless void. Each failure left him more certain that the answer lay just beyond his grasp. Each small success feeding the conviction that he could outwit the slow decay eating at his own flesh. All the while, the war on Rusan dragged on, a brutal stalemate fought in sweltering valleys and under skies blackened by the smoke of constant bombardment. The Jedi pushed harder with each campaign season, their army of light tightening the noose around the Brotherhood's strongholds. And within those strongholds, the political game reached new heights of paranoia and desperation. Every council meeting was a theater of veiled threats and false camaraderie, the unspoken knowledge hanging in the air that soon the war would end for one side or the other, and that in the Brotherhood of Darkness, survival after the war might be the hardest battle yet. The Valley of the Jedi. The orders came wrapped in the language of destiny, the kind of rhetoric that in the Brotherhood of Darkness was as dangerous as any weapon. The Valley of the Jedi, a name spoken in half-reverent, half-fearful tones, even among Sith Lords, was to be the site of the Brotherhood's final and decisive strike against the Jedi army of light. The ancient records spoke of the valley as a place where the Force pooled like water in a basin, a nexus of energy unlike any other in the galaxy, its roots stretching back to the fabled Battle of Ruusan centuries before. To control it was to command the currents of the Force across star systems. To lose it was to watch the war's tide shift irreversibly. Lord Khan himself summoned the lords to his war council, the air inside his command pavilion heavy with the scent of burning oils and the rustle of maps being unrolled. Holo displays shimmered with topographical readouts of the valley, jagged cliffs rising like the teeth of some ancient predator, a broad basin carpeted in strange pale grass that rippled even when the wind was still, and at its heart the black silhouette of the temple. Khan's voice was a steady, measured cadence, promising total victory if the Brotherhood could hold the valley and draw the Jedi into a final, annihilating engagement. But beneath the rhetoric, the protagonist heard the undercurrent, a note of obsession, of desperation, and in the way, Bane, standing at the far edge of the council like a shadow carved into human form, watched Khan with unblinking intensity. There was the suggestion of another plan moving unseen beneath the official strategy. Rumors whispered through the ranks that Bane had been seen in the archives, poring over texts older than the Republic itself, and that the ancient Sith Lords had granted him a vision, a weapon that could end the war in a single moment, the thought bomb, the whispers said, an echo of a ritual so forbidden it had been buried in the darkest vaults. If unleashed, it would consume every force sensitive within its reach, tearing their essence from flesh and binding it in eternal torment. Whether Khan knew of Bane's true intentions or was merely being played by him was a question the protagonist kept to himself. In the nights before the march, he walked the perimeter of the Brotherhood's encampment, staring at the distant line of the valley's cliffs under the pale light of Ruusan's moons. The force there was different, thicker, heavier, as if it clung to the skin, pulling the mind inward. Each breath in that direction felt deeper, fuller, but also colder, as though something in the valley's depths was drinking from him in turn. By the time the army moved, the unease had become a steady weight at the base of his skull. The march itself was a spectacle of Sith power, columns of black-armored soldiers, banners snapping in the dry wind, war beasts brought from the menageries of Droman Khas and Korriban straining at their chains. Overhead, Sith gunships cut lazy arcs through the sky, their hulls gleaming with the faint red light of Korriban's sun reflected in the dust. The valley swallowed them whole, its cliffs rising higher with each step until the sky was reduced to a narrow strip overhead. The temple at its center grew steadily larger, its spires jagged and uneven, as if it had been carved by a hand that neither understood nor cared for symmetry. The closer they came, the stronger the pull of the place became, until it felt as if the force itself was guiding each footfall. He took the first opportunity to scout the temple alone, slipping away from the main force under the pretense of securing an approach. The structure was older than anything he had seen, its stones worn but unbroken, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when looked at too long. The entrance yawned wide, a black mouth exhaling air so cold it bit into the lungs, carrying the faint scent of something metallic and ancient. Inside, the corridors were lit by the ghostly shimmer of crystal veins embedded in the stone, their light pulsing faintly in time with his heartbeat. The silence was absolute, oppressive, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind threading through the passageways like a living thing. He reached the central chamber and froze. There, in the half-light, stood a figure in brown and tan, lightsaber hilt unlit in one hand. A Jedi. Young, perhaps not much older than he had been when Lord Revek took him from his home. The man's eyes were wary but not hostile, his posture one of readiness rather than aggression. "You don't want to be here," the Jedi said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "When this begins, it won't end with victory for either side." The protagonist studied him, sensing no deception in his tone, only a quiet conviction. "And yet here you are," he replied. "So either you believe you can stop it, or you've accepted your death." The Jedi's lips tightened in something like a grim smile. Maybe both. What followed was an uneasy truce, the kind forged in moments when survival aligns more strongly than allegiance. Together they explored the deeper chambers, encountering strange Force echoes, faint visions of warriors long dead, replaying moments of triumph or despair, locked in endless loops. In one chamber, the floor was a mosaic depicting the ancient battle, Jedi and Sith locked in combat beneath a sky split by lightning. In another, a pool of still, black water reflected not their faces but scenes of possible futures, each more catastrophic than the last. By the time they emerged into the valley again, the first thunder of battle was already rolling across the basin. The Jedi army of light had arrived, their lines stretching from cliff to cliff, banners of white and gold snapping in the wind. The Brotherhood met them in kind, the clash of the two forces reverberating through the ground like distant earthquakes. He fought alongside the Jedi at first, the strange alliance born of necessity holding just long enough to carve through the initial wave of combatants. But as the battle swelled, the lines dissolved into chaos. Sith and Jedi dueling in twos and threes, blaster fire stitching the air, Force lightning arcing in jagged lines that lit the sky. Above it all, the temple loomed, and somewhere within, Bane was completing the ritual. The protagonist felt it before he saw it, a gathering, a tightening, as if the Force itself were being wound into a coil ready to snap. The Jedi beside him felt it too. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that silent exchange was the understanding that whatever was coming could not be stopped now. The ground trembled, dust cascading from the cliffs. The air grew thick, heavy, until each breath was an effort, the taste of metal sharp on the tongue. Then, at the center of the battlefield, a light bloomed, not the warm light of the sun, but a cold, hungry brilliance that seemed to pull the world inward. It expanded in an instant, a wave of blinding white shot through with threads of black, and as it passed over them, the protagonist felt himself unmade. There was no pain, only the sensation of being pulled apart in every direction, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. He saw flashes, faces of those he had killed, the desert of his birth world, the red glow of Korriban's skies, and then even those dissolved, leaving only the endless, echoing roar of the thought bomb as it consumed all it touched. The last thing he knew was the weightless drift into darkness, the pull of the valley's heart drawing him into a prison from which there would be no escape, not in this life or any other. The end and legacy. The instant the thought bomb erupted, the world ceased to have edges, shapes, or boundaries. There was no ground beneath his feet, no sky above his head, only a horizonless expanse of blinding, cold light, laced with threads of something darker than night. The wave passed through him without resistance, and yet it took everything, flesh, bone, breath, heartbeat, the warmth of blood, and the weight of muscle, until what remained was awareness alone, a naked, raw consciousness pulled taut like a thread in a vast, endless loom. There was no falling, no floating, only a state of being suspended in the roaring tide of the Force itself, the sensation at once infinite and suffocating. In those first moments, he thought it was death, but there was no release, no slipping away into the formless quiet he had always half suspected would follow the final heartbeat. Instead, there was the pull, the constant inward drag toward the core of the valley, as if some colossal gravity well had opened and drawn every shred of life and thought into its center. He felt the others there, hundreds of them, Jedi and Sith alike, their essences tangled together in a thrashing knot of rage, terror, confusion, and grief. Identities clung for a time, voices shrieking names, curses, pleas, but the boundaries between them were already eroding under the pressure of the prison that held them. Time lost its meaning almost immediately. There was no sun to rise or set, no heartbeat to mark the seconds, no breath to measure one moment from the next. Memory surfaced and sank in no discernible order. He would feel again the sting of Korriban's dust in his lungs, then the weight of a lightsaber in his hand, then see the Myrialan Jedi's eyes in those final seconds of their duel, only for it to be replaced by the face of Lord Revek stepping into his family's home. Sometimes the memories were not his. He saw battles he had never fought, worlds he had never walked, because in this prison, the minds of the trapped bled into each other, sharing fragments of lives until it became impossible to tell where one ended and another began. The hatred between Sith and Jedi persisted in those first stretches, clashing here in this formless realm as it had on the battlefield, flaring into psychic duels of will and memory, each trying to dominate the other in a place where victory meant nothing but the temporary illusion of control. But as whatever passed for centuries here wore on, even that faded. The force currents that churned through this prison were constant and inescapable, grinding down personalities like stones in a river until all that remained were smoothed shapes, the sharp edges worn away. He fought against it at first, holding to his name, his face, the sound of his own voice as he remembered it, clinging to each as if it were an anchor. Yet each time he gathered himself, the pull tore another piece away. There were moments, years perhaps, or only minutes, when he wondered if he had already been erased and what remained was just an echo, some reflex of will repeating old thoughts in an empty chamber. The outside world was nothing but a faint vibration at the edges of perception, like the sound of distant thunder muffled through walls of stone. Once, a long time after the light of the thought bomb had burned away into the constant grey of this prison, he felt something different, a ripple, a presence moving through the valley, strong and deliberate. It was like feeling heat after an eternity in ice. The presence did not speak, but its will pressed against the prison's boundaries, probing, assessing. He recognized it not by memory of voice or face, but by the shape of its ambition. It was Bane, alive, untouched by the prison that had claimed the rest. The awareness lingered for a while, pulling strands of knowledge from the trapped, and in its wake came a sense of something larger being set into motion, though he could not see what. After that, there were only long stretches of stillness again, broken by occasional flickers, curious explorers brushing against the valley's edge, scavengers searching for relics, force sensitives drawn by the dark gravity of the place only to retreat when the air turned heavy with the unseen weight of so many bound spirits. With each ripple from outside came the briefest reminder of the galaxy beyond, a pulse of life and motion so alien now it might as well have been another universe. In the absence of time, he learned to inhabit memory differently, moving through his past as though walking the corridors of the Sith Academy again, lingering in the scent of scorched stone, the hiss of blades clashing under the overseer's gaze. He revisited battles, not as they happened, but as they might have been, winning duels he had lost, sparing, enemies he had killed, imagining paths where he had turned away from the Sith entirely. It was not regret that drove these visions, but a need to feel the texture of choice again, to remind himself that he had once been more than a voice in the current. And yet, no matter where the memory wandered, it always returned to the moment in the valley, the young Jedi's voice saying, maybe both, the weight of understanding in that shared glance before the light came. Over time, the distinction between self and the others in the prison grew thinner. Whispers merged into a constant murmur, then into something more like a shared consciousness, a restless sea of thought in which his own mind was just one wave among thousands. He resisted being subsumed completely, not because he believed he could escape, but because surrender felt like a second death, the true one. Holding himself apart was an act of defiance, the last thing that was still his. There were legends, he realized, even here, stories traded among the bound about release, about rituals that could shatter the prison, about force adepts strong enough to unmake what Bane had wrought. He had no way of knowing if they were true or simply inventions to keep madness at bay. Yet some part of him hoped, not for freedom. He had stopped imagining a galaxy in which he could walk under the sky again, but for the chance to choose something, anything, when the moment came. Until then, he drifted in the endless dark of the valley's heart, A shadow among shadows, one more voice in the silent chorus that waited beneath the surface of Rusun, ready to brush against the mind of any who dared to walk too close to the place where the Force had been twisted into its most perfect trap.